Hi, everyone. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and thank you for coming to my channel. And today I want to discuss two essays by G.E. Moore entitled A Defense of Common Sense, which was published in 1925, and Proof of the External World, which was published in 1939. Just so you know, Proof of the External World I actually read this morning is quite short. You can Google it and find a free copy online. Maybe it's, I think, like 3 or 4 pages, and it's a quite easy read. So I would recommend, if at the very least, that you read that. You may even want to stop the video now and read it before you listen to the rest of the discussion. A Defense of Common Sense is also an essay. It's not terribly long, but it's a little bit more of a commitment. And just to be clear right off the bat, I had a very strong reaction when I read Defense of Common Sense. I read this in the spring of 2025 because I was sitting in on a history of analytic philosophy class at the CUNY Graduate Center, and we read this for one of the classes. And as I'm reading it, like I am having this very strong reaction of wanting to like argue with Moore because I felt like what he was saying was just um, ridiculous to me. And so I will get into that as we go through, but I just wanted to be honest with you there. So it's hard for me to recommend that you read The Defense of Common Sense, but also in the same spirit, it's an important part of the history of analytic philosophy and G.E. Moore. And it's also important to read things that we don't like because, in some sense, my strong reaction says something about my philosophy, says something about how I see philosophy and what he's saying. And although I didn't like it, I think it's useful to read things we don't like. Sometimes people change our minds, and other times when we read something we don't like, it just forces us to sharpen up what it is that we think, how we think. So G.E. Moore lived from 1873 to 1958, and he was an important figure in the development of analytic philosophy. Usually that's attributed to Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, with Frege being a predecessor of them, an important predecessor, but it was often attributed to Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore for popularizing analytic philosophy. And Bertrand Russell is often attributed to sort of reinvigorating Frege's writing because they've sort of been lost to obscurity. Um, but I would say I much prefer Bertrand Russell. I mean, I love reading Bertrand Russell. It's not that I agree with everything he says, but I think he's a good writer, and I appreciate his approach to writing philosophy. And I had a hard time with more. But okay, enough of me just complaining about complaining about more. Let me get into it. Before I get into it, though, one more thing. One of the reasons why I want to do this video is because I want to talk about Wittgenstein's uncertainty, which in many ways is a reaction to what Moore had said. So I just want to say that because I will also be recording a video about uncertainty by Wittgenstein, and I much prefer Wittgenstein's approach to this topic. And so if you watch this video, that's the next video you should check out in order to complete the discussion that's going on here. Okay, but in order to do that properly, I need to first tell you what Moore is talking about, right? So let's start with Proof of the External World because it's shorter. But again, they're very much related to each other. And so, we will talk about both of them uh, in due time here. But if we start with Proof of the External World, I just want to literally just read, um, just want to read a few quotes from here so that you can get an idea of what's going on. So, in the very beginning of Proof of the External World, Moore writes, I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist. How? By holding up two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is one hand, and adding, as I make a certain gesture with the left, here is another. And if by doing this I have proved ipso facto the existence of external things, you will also see that I can also do it now in a number of other ways. There is no need to multiply examples, and he's not going to multiply examples. But this already gives you a feel for what Moore is going to do. I mean, I think in part what I'm reacting to here, and maybe you already notice it, is this is a weird attitude to take in a philosophy paper. Like, I'm confused as to why he's taking this attitude. Of course, I think we all agree that in everyday life, we go around assuming that, yes, here's my left hand, here's my right, and I'm not going to like doubt this everywhere I go. I'm going to take this for granted. Yes, these are facts I take for granted. In that much, I think we all agree with Moore. What I think is confusing about Moore's essay is what is a philosopher doing trying to make that argument, right? Like, we're confused as to where he's trying to go with this fact. Like, don't get me wrong. Yes, I think we should all in everyday life assume that we have hands, and I don't need to give a proof that I have hands in order to go about the world. But it is confusing in what sense a philosopher is trying to make an argument by just saying, see, here I have hands, right? And a lot of Moore's argument seems to be of that flavor. Let me read a little bit further down um, in the essay. Kant says it is a scandal not to be able to give a proof of the existence of external objects, such as hands or tables and things like that. He says that if it occurs to anyone to question their existence, we ought to be able to confront him with a satisfactory proof. I have been given conclusive proof of the existence of external objects. It was a proof that two human hands existed at the time when I gave the proof. It is also obvious that I could give many others now, so that if these are the sort of proof that is wanted, nothing is easier than to prove the existence of external objects. But now I am perfectly aware that, in spite of all that I have said, many philosophers will still feel that I have not given any satisfactory proof of the point in question. And I want briefly, in conclusion, to say something as to why that dissatisfaction with my proof should be felt. So, of course, Moore is a philosopher. He understands, he's read a lot of philosophy, and so he knows that what he's said so far is not going to be sufficient, really, to anyone. But I would say his explanation of why it's not sufficient is not that satisfying. Though one thing that he does bring up, which I think is important, which Wittgenstein will bring up in Uncertainty, is this idea that explanation comes to an end somewhere, right? You might say, how do you know that your hands exist? And you might want some argument for knowing that these hands exist. And Moore, though I don't think he explains this very well, and I much prefer Wittgenstein, I think his point to some degree is that I can give you a further argument, but is it going to make the fact that my hands exist any more certain if I give you that argument? So where do I start the argument uh, so that you will feel that it's completely convincing, right? Again, Wittgenstein does a much better job of exploring this, in my opinion. But Moore understands that's going to be a problem. But the part that makes Moore so frustrating is he seems to be just yelling loudly in his essays. Again, you can't. It just feels like he's just making these claims in a forceful way, almost like a dogmatic way, and he's not willing to entertain any other views in any serious way. He understands that his arguments are not going to be completely convincing to everyone, but he just seems to think that you just say it and that's enough, and again, I just find this so frustrating. I'm sorry that I just keep proclaiming my frustration and not getting more into the details, but I do think that's the only way to react in some sense to Moore, because he's kind of doing the same thing. And again, I will get more substantive when we get into Wittgenstein's approach. But I just want to say a bit of what has come from this is they call these things now Morean facts, which are these things that we don't prove, we don't give any kind of arguments for, we just know with certainty and we just kind of take as assumptions. Um, Again, it's a little bit confusing. Like, what does it mean to know something with certainty? Moore is not going to really even get into that issue. And to me, that is a major part of what philosophy should at least try to do, is to give some discussion of what it means to be certain of things. And I agree that perhaps we should, of course, we should go around assuming that we have a right and a left hand. But I don't understand why a philosopher would try to rest his case there. Okay, let me try to say a little bit more about defensive common sense. In defensive common sense, it's a bit longer, and the way that the article is set up is that more here. It should be pointed out that defensive common sense was written first, even though I'm talking about them in reverse. In defensive common sense, he starts by listing out a bunch of Morean facts. Of course, he doesn't call it that, but that's what we call them now. And I won't say them all, but just to give you an idea, they're similar to the existence of a left and right hand. He says that there exists at present a living human body, which is my body. This body was born at a certain time in the past and has existed continuously ever since, though not without undergoing changes. It was, for instance, much smaller than it was born, and for some time afterwards than it is now. Ever since it was born, it has been either in contact with or not far from the surface of the earth. At every moment since it was born, there has also existed many other things, having shape and size in three dimensions, which it has been at various distances, so on and so forth. He just keeps listing out all these what we now call Morean facts, which he thinks we should just take for granted as common sense notions. And he's not going to provide any argument for them. He just knows them. And he's just going to just say that with confidence that he knows these things with certainty. One thing that you should point out, one thing you should keep in mind here is that all these facts that he starts with are facts about himself as a person, and I can make the same facts about myself, and each individual can make these statements, these declarations about themselves. And then later on he points out that he also believes that there are other people in the world, so not just himself, but other people who can also declare these facts, and he believes that those facts about them are true, meaning that it's not just him who has a body and seems to be walking around, has a right and a left hand, but that there are these other people outside of him that have these bodies as well. And this, of course, is being done intentionally because Moore understands philosophy. He's read about philosophy, and he understands the makeup of the different philosophers that he needs to interact with. So he's purposely breaking up these Morean facts into two categories. There's the first category, which are the facts that he knows about himself, and then there's the second category, which are the facts that he knows about other people. And the reason why he does that in the essay is because then he's going to contrast that with two broadly different kinds of philosophers in his categorizing of philosophers. And I think the way that we would categorize these are there are the skeptics, and then there are the idealists. So in the skepticism slash solipsism camp, I think he has as a caricature Descartes, right? So when I say solipsism, that's the view that the only mind or the only conscious being in the world that I can be confident of is myself. And I don't know that anyone else is conscious. I can assume that they are, but I don't know this. And so solipsism basically says that the only thing that I can be confident of is that I myself as a conscious being exists. And of course, I don't need to get into all the details about exactly what we mean when we say ourself and how far we want to doubt those different things, because I don't want to get into a huge sidebar discussion. And really, Moore is just taking a caricature of this philosophy in his argument. Though I think he has a sophisticated understanding of these things, and in particular, Descartes is a good caricature here because famously Descartes is a skeptic who tries to doubt everything and tries to find like some one fact that he could use to as like a base that he can then build upon from there, right? And his fact, the famous fact that Descartes says is, "I think, therefore I am." And at the base of I think, therefore I am is this idea that I could at least be confident of myself as some entity. Again, we can, that brings up questions about what exactly do you mean by yourself. Are you just talking about some soul, which is probably something like what Descartes had in mind, or do you just have some sort of psychologically continuous I there in your mind, or whatever? I don't want to get too much into this, but the point is that one of the camps that Moore wants to criticize are the skeptics, and these people he sees as being skeptical about his Morean facts. Um, and in some sense, the skeptic just retreats to other facts that he wants to take for granted. Like, if in particular Descartes um, take is going to take for granted that there is some notion of a conscious being, and then from there Descartes is going to try to build up and get to common sense notions. But Moore thinks that the skeptic is making a mistake in not sort of accepting the Morean facts. But the second kind of caricature of a philosopher that Moore wants to interact with are the idealists. And for him, the idealists are like the skeptics. I think he thinks are making a mistake, that they're just not willing to be certain of certain things, and that's a mistake. But he sees the idealist as being as actually making a contradiction, or maybe being a hypocrite in some sense, because the idealists will acknowledge the sense data that we're talking about, that there, I can see a hand here and I can see a hand there, but they do not acknowledge like physical objects in any sense. And here I really kind of get frustrated. The more we'll say, like, any idealist is still going to live their life as if physical objects exist. And I get his point to some degree, but I think that's a little bit unfair to the idealists. And again, the caricature here, I think, is Berkeley. I mean, Berkeley understands that he has to somehow account for the sense data of these hands that I see, right? And so it's not like Berkeley is going to deny that this sense data, that he's seeing hands, right? He's just going to give a different explanation for how to explain that sense data. And again, I'll give a little bit of a caricature. He gives some kind of explanation that, like, all of this exists in the mind of God, and that like all these things that are happening are somehow taking place in the mind of God, almost like some kind of big simulation in some sense, but all very real in the mind of God. And again, that's way too simple. If you want to understand Berkeley, then you should go deeper, and this caricature is not going to do it for you. But I just feel like Moore is, I don't know, it just doesn't feel like he's taking seriously what the idealists are doing. And again, I'm not a big fan of idealism. I'm not going to spend a lot of time thinking about it per se and interacting with it, but I don't think it's reasonable to just throw it out as them being contradictory or something like that, because I think it is possible to come up with a philosophy that explains the existence of my hands that I can see right now, not necessarily as physical objects. And I don't suggest that that's the way we live our lives, but I don't think it's ridiculous to do that. And Moore doesn't really, in my opinion, give any argument for why you shouldn't, that why the idealists aren't reasonable philosophers. Like, I don't know. At least not. I don't think that this essay does the trick. And yeah, I'm sorry if at times I'm not interacting with the text as much as I would normally like to, but I really I'm disappointed in this text, to be quite honest, and there's no other way to express it. I hope if you are more sympathetic to some of the things I'm saying in Moore's favor, I hope you read it, and if you disagree with me, I would love to hear your argument for why. But I think I prefer Hume's approach. Of course, Hume is also a famous skeptic, but he doesn't. Hume doesn't try to take the move, doesn't try to make the move that Descartes makes. And I really like Hume in general, and I would recommend that you read on the Inquiry of Scientific Nature, which is only like 100 pages long and is very readable, even though it was written in the 1700s. Highly recommend it. But I like in the Treatise of Human Nature, there's like a little reflection that Hume does, because Hume is very much skeptical, famously skeptical of cause and effect and induction in science, and he's skeptical of whether we can establish moral laws, uh, you know, for on as like uh, complete, completely true facts and things like this. So he's very much known as being a skeptic, but he's reasonable, and he has this reflection where he says that you can't go about your everyday life constantly doubting things, right? You have to just take for granted that you have hands and that there are physical objects out there. You have to take for granted that there's some cause and effect sometimes, and you have to take for granted that if you do some experiments, you might get some insight about the world. Like he's not arguing that you shouldn't go about everyday life with these things in mind, and he actually, as far as history seems to suggest, he's actually able to do this. And as I understand it, he was quite a sociable person and able to kind of move about the world quite effectively. But he also, in his philosophical writing, is quite skeptical. And to me, this is how a philosopher should be. Um, it's not that we should go about constantly doubting whether we have hands, but to me, and I think this is why I dislike More's papers, is because to me, a philosopher in philosophy should be about stripping away some of those everyday notions and taking a look under the hood and trying to understand what's going on underneath, right? So it's not that I go about everyday life doubting all these things either. I have to make all kinds of assumptions in everyday life. And I completely agree with Moore that I should do that and that I should use common sense and all these things. But I just think that philosophy should be about stripping away those assumptions and trying to take a look underneath and trying to examine some of the everyday assumptions that we make. And that's why I think I find Moore's essays just so offensive, because it just feels like he's like, what is Moore's concept of what philosophy is? Like, okay, you seem to have a very different idea about what philosophy is. Can you tell me what you think philosophers should do? And maybe there's something else I can read by Moore that would do that for me, but I'm not so sure what that is, and I honestly haven't read it yet. So I'm going to leave it there, because I think I can just keep saying negative things about this essay for a while, and I'm not sure how much more content would come from that. But I just want to remind you that one of the reasons why I did this discussion is because I want to talk about Uncertainty by Ludwig Wittgenstein. I really like that book, and that book interacts with very much Moore's these two essays by Moore. Wittgenstein famously said that he thinks that these two essays by Moore were the best things that Moore did. I think also, though, Wittgenstein didn't think Moore did very many very important things in philosophy. So I think this is slightly tongue in cheek, but I do think that Wittgenstein takes these essays quite seriously. But I think Wittgenstein interacts with them in a much more interesting way, and so I will save that for the next essay. So please comment if you disagree with me. Please comment, and I'd be happy to hear what you have to say, and like and share this. And I hope to see you at another video.